title I have for my presentation tonight, as you can see, is Urban Design as an Act of Healing. And it's the premise that in cities we've become really disconnected from nature, and that one of the responsibilities as a designer is to try and look at ways of reconnecting that. And in part because, as E.O. Wilson, who's a Harvard biologist, talks about, it is intrinsic in us, that idea that nature is within us. And as a result, we really want to make sure that that's available to us living in cities. And of course, we see that showing up in a number of ways. When I lived in New England, they showed on the nightly forecast where the color line was, so that you could go out there and find out where the best color was, and people would rampage around the landscape for that. Recently, I was down in the Grand Canyon, and again, there's another place that people spend a lot of money to and queue up. It takes 3 to 6 months to get a permit to hike down into the Grand Canyon. So it's a very competitive place, a very desirable place for people to get to. So there's that idea of nature's reverence, which is really important as part of our experience. There's the idea of nature as metaphor. That is, we recreate nature in a number of ways to represent some idealized thing, some idealized place. The Japanese gardens are famous for that idea, that we're trying to manifest our aspirations of nature in some certain kinds of forms. And so it's another one of these elements of how we represent ourselves through our understanding of nature. And then, of course, the idea of shared space. That is, we share it with others. And unfortunately, I was reading recently that once every 15 minutes, there's an elephant poached somewhere for its ivory. And it raises this question of how do we balance this idea of our aspirations with our consumption. And so I put this in here, this ecological footprint, which one of my profs at UBC years ago coined this term. And it got me thinking about, what do I do as a landscape architect in the way I design spaces? And how can I do a better job of that through the work that I do? And part of that is better understanding ecosystems, and that ecosystems themselves have a carrying capacity. And that we can't just blindly go ahead and start designing things without understanding that context within which we work. And it's a very fragile idea, this idea of ecosystem function. And it then led me to an architect named Christopher Alexander, who said that every increment of construction must be made in such a way as to heal the city. And I thought that was an incredibly profound statement, that if we put that out there with every decision we made, it would change how we did things, fundamentally change how we did things. And so that's the premise of what I'm going to talk about here. And it's this idea of moving beyond sustainable design. Sustainable design is just sustaining things where they're at. It's too far past that. We need to start getting to this regenerative thing. Sustainable design has often been talked about doing things less badly. And our goal is to do things well. So that's where some of my interests are coming from. And the starting point is on the regional scale landscape. That is, you start with your assets. You start with a nature park, for example, and you build eco-zones around that. Just as we regulate development through zoning, we should do that with zones of ecological function. So the closer you live to some of these places, the more you have to be attuned to what you do. And this was a project I did for the city of Christchurch many years ago, on how to build these zones of adjacency to help with connections and ecological function. So it starts with the regional landscape. That's the first big move that we have to be thinking about. And we do that here with the ecological network that we've started in the city. So that's a big, important move that we've dealt with in Richmond. The next one is buildings. We want to move beyond these lead titles and look at living buildings. And this is the Van Deusen Visitor Center, which is a unique building because it handles all of its own waste, and it handles all of its own water and its own energy. So it's moving into this living building where it actually functions like an ecosystem in that regard. And it's quite beautiful as well. I mean, it's one of these things where this is the great thing, is when you do it well, you get both function and beauty in the same place, which is inherently a natural process that we're looking at. So the buildings, regional landscape, those are two of the pivotal parts of what we're interested in. The next one is making water really a visible part of the landscape. This is a sewage treatment plant in front of a school in the US that treats all of its waste. And yet it's this interesting place that's used for the science students. It's used as a play space, but it's also a functioning sewage treatment facility. Who would have thought? right? This is over in Victoria. It's a stormwater pond that takes water that drains off of the neighborhood, and it treats it before it releases out into the ocean. And there's even steps that invite you to come down and sit beside the edge. I think it's a beautiful, elegant little piece that changes the way we think about stormwater, rainwater. And it's one of those gestures, again, as a designer, we should be doing better. Functional faces and building facades. Another tenet of this idea is that every face of a building should have some contribution, whether it's farming on roofs or whether it's naturation of building facades. We shouldn't just accept that buildings have to be these inert things. And that leads me to the next piece, which is parks. Of course, this is what I do. They're the most democratic part of the world, of our cities. They should be places that encourage people to come out to them and engage them. And of course, Terra Nova is one of those great places, one of the great parks of the world, in my view. And not just because we have this great play space that we've encouraged people to come out to and get reconnected with nature. We've dealt with this. This is the lowest carbon footprint playground that's been built in Canada that I'm aware of. And we do that because of the nature of the materials that we use, the way we've installed those materials, and the way we've gotten people back outside. And what we find here is we get parents playing alongside of kids. So the idea of being digitally focused and letting your kid run off, they're not doing that so much here. We've had these great picnicking events going on out here, which we don't see at the same level in our other parks. So we know there's this thirst for nature. We just have to provide the means for people to re-engage that. And so that's what we're trying to do. I'm particularly interested in, but that's what we're trying to do here in the city of Richmond. So I think that's the last image, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you.